Hi everyone, the goal of this video is to learn about the effects of the Civil War. The Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, almost exactly 4 years. During the Civil War, this is what our map looked like. The white and tan areas are the states and territories of the United States, and the red area are the states of the Confederacy. The Civil War was between the United States Army and the Confederate Army. The Civil War affected everybody in the United States. This included U.S. and Confederate soldiers, people who lived near the battlefields, African Americans, women, children, and families. We're going to focus on each of these groups and how their different perspectives and experiences shaped how they saw the Civil War. We're going to start by looking at U.S. and Confederate soldiers. Life as a soldier was not easy, as you can imagine. Soldiers often suffered from homesickness, depression, illness, poor hygiene, hunger, substandard living conditions, which meant that where they lived was not really appropriate, inadequate medical treatment, and boredom. Out of all of these, only one of them might be surprising to you, and that's boredom. But actually, a lot of time spent as a soldier is spent just kind of waiting around for your next orders, for the next battle, or for the next drill practice. So they had a couple of different ways to deal with the homesickness and the boredom and distracted themselves with some games. They would often play cards while they were at camp, and they would also play dominoes while they were waiting for their next order or their next drill practice. Not every part of being a soldier involved battlefields. A lot of the time, they were just waiting around in their camps. Soldiers were every age, pretty much. The average age of a soldier was 18 to 30. But at the beginning of the war, there was a Union general, General Winfield Scott, who was 74 years old. And as the war continued, soldiers became younger and younger as there were more casualties of the people between that 18 and 30-year range. In fact, we have one, Sergeant John Clem, who became a sergeant or a leader in the military at only 12 years old. More than 3,900 boys 16 and younger served just in the United States Army. So there were a lot of young children who were working in the Army, fighting in the Army, and even in some places, like John Clem, were leaders in the Army. There also was the constant possibility of death as a soldier. There are 3 million soldiers that fought in the Civil War. 620,000 of them die. That's 2% of the entire population of the United States during that Civil War period. Here we have kind of a graph that shows the casualties on both sides. A casualty means that it's one person who was killed or wounded during the war. So you can see, according to this chart, there are about 650,000 Union or United States casualties and almost 500,000 Confederate casualties. And then underneath those big numbers, it breaks down how many there were according to each category. So, for example, in battle, this first category, battle deaths, shows that almost 200,000 on both sides die in battle. But if you look below, you'll see that many more die because of disease. Disease is a major killer during the Civil War. More than twice as many soldiers die from disease than from battle. So as a soldier, you are twice as more likely to die from disease than to die in battle. And then those final two categories show that there are many that are wounded in action. Remember that a casualty is either being killed or wounded. And then also we have our numbers of prisoners of war on both sides. So this is going to take us into Civil War medicine, this idea of disease. We saw at the very beginning that soldiers had very poor hygiene. They suffered from hunger, so they weren't really, they didn't have a lot of nutritious meals. They ate what they were given, and it wasn't always the best for you nutrition wise. And then that poor hygiene, meaning that they didn't always brush their teeth, they didn't always take a shower. If they took a bath, maybe it was in a dirty river because that was all they could do. So medicine is really important during the Civil War, both in the camp and on the battlefield. And we're going to start by looking at an image. This is a real photograph of an amputation in a hospital tent at the Battle of Gettysburg. Remember, that's that battle that happened in Pennsylvania in July of 1863. And in this image, you can see the doctor in the center holding some sort of implement to perform the amputation or to take off the soldier's limb. During the Civil War, amputating was going to be a really, really common way of solving whatever problem the soldier had. So if a soldier got shot in the arm or the leg, it was often better for the doctor to just amputate that limb and then move on to the next person. This would be an example of an amputation kit used by doctors. You can see there are lots of saws and implements and lots of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily see in a hospital or used by a doctor anymore. An experienced doctor could amputate a limb in under 10 minutes. And in our next couple of photographs, you'll see why that's really important. Battlefield, this is an image of a battlefield hospital at the Battle of Savage's Station, which was a battle that took place in Henrico, Virginia. All of these men that you see lying on the ground were wounded in that Battle of Savage's Station. And they're just kind of lying around waiting to be taken back to these tents that make up the hospital. So at each battle, you would have doctors and nurses and other medical people that were away from the battlefield but close by, setting up these tents, and this would have been the hospital that soldiers would have gone to. Just like that amputation photograph, this is a real photograph from that battle in Henrico, Battle of Savage's Station. And what would happen is you would have nurses and other people walking up and down the aisles of these men that had been wounded and trying to find the most important injuries, the ones that you had to solve first. And they would be the ones that would go back to the tent first. If you had a non-fatal injury or an injury that could wait a while, you could be laying here for hours waiting for an empty tent and waiting for a doctor that could see you. So this is why it's important for doctors to be able to find a way to solve injuries that's quick, like amputating the leg, rather than dealing with finding the bullet and making sure it's clean and sealing the wound. It was easier and quicker for the doctors to just amputate the limb and move on to the next person in need. This is a image, a real photograph of a hospital. This is Douglas Hospital, this building in Washington, D.C. And at this hospital, there were so many injured soldiers that they had to add all of these tents to keep soldiers who had been seen and needed to rest, or as a place for doctors to see patients. So this kind of gives you the idea of how many people were injured or wounded during the Civil War that needed help. And it also gives you an idea of how difficult it must have been for the doctors and nurses to be able to help everybody who needed it. We're going to move on now to women in the Civil War because the first woman we're going to look at is a natural transition. She is Clara Barton, and she was a Civil War nurse. She followed the army for 3 years throughout Virginia and South Carolina, and she was a big help because she brought a lot of supplies, like medical supplies, even including things like socks and blankets that the soldiers needed, the injured soldiers needed. And she was a big help. Her nickname is the Angel of the Battlefield because of how selfless she was and how much she helped the people who needed it. In 1881, so about 15 years after the war, she creates the American Red Cross, which is an organization that helps injured people. So she takes what she learned in the Civil War and continues that even after the war is over. Our next woman you've heard of before is Harriet Tubman. She was a Civil War spy. So we know that before the war, she helped hundreds of enslaved African Americans escape to freedom on the Underground Railroad. But during the war, she continues her important work. She leads raids and expeditions for the United States Army in South Carolina. Remember, she had a lot of knowledge of the landscape and the geography of the South from her work on the Underground Railroad. So she was able to use that knowledge to help the United States Army get around the geography and the landscape during the war. Our next woman is going to be an example of somebody, of many people who did the same thing as her. Her name is Frances Clayton. She was a Civil War soldier. So it's important to note that both the US and the Confederacy prohibited women from fighting in the war. This means that women were not allowed to fight in the war during the Civil War. But some women disguised themselves as men so that they could fight. They were so passionate about the cause that they wanted to fight just like the men were. And so they would dress up as men and pretend to be men in order to be able to fight in the war. So here we have a picture of Frances Clayton on the left as her life before and after the Civil War. And on the right, you see her dressed up as a man so that she would be able to fight in the Civil War. There were also women who were not directly involved in the battles, in the wars, but they were impacted by the Civil War. So in both of these images, you can see a shopkeeper and a farmer, and then their wives working with them. Before the Civil War, men were the ones who would own the shops and own the farms, and they would have their wives help them, but they would be the ones doing most of the work. Well, during the Civil War, these men went off to battle. And so the women were left to take care of their family's store, to take care of their family's farm by themselves. They had to make money for the family, take care of the children, make sure they had enough food and shelter and water and logs to keep their home warm. So even the women that were not directly involved in battle, the women who weren't on the battlefield as nurses or pretending to be men in order to fight, they were also majorly impacted by the Civil War. Women on the home front also see images of battles in newspapers. So this is a real image of a battlefield. This would be after the battle is over. And you can see how sad it is to see these casualties of the war before they are taken and buried. And images like these would have been in newspapers for everyone across America and everyone across the world to see what was happening on these battlefields. It would have been really shocking to see an image like this, because it's one thing to hear that there's a battle happening nearby, and another thing to actually see the destruction of it and the lives that are lost from it. A man named Matthew Brady is the man that we can thank for these really powerful images. He was a photographer during the Civil War. Photography would have been a really new technology. It would not have really existed before the Civil War. So he knew that he could use this new technology of photography to capture these really powerful images. And he would travel from battlefield to battlefield and from camp to camp to take images of the soldiers and the battlefields and the camps so that we today understand what it was really like. It's a really important job that he decided to take on to be able to show everybody what it was like during the war. Next, we're going to talk about the impact on African Americans. And we're going to start with the African American soldiers. So African Americans fought in the US and in the Confederate armies. In the United States Army, African American soldiers weren't really allowed to fight until after the Emancipation Proclamation. Remember, Abraham Lincoln says that all enslaved people are free when he signs the Emancipation Proclamation. After that, it makes freeing enslaved people the focus or the point of the war. And so enslaved African Americans escaped to the North to be able to fight for their freedom, and free African Americans who were already free and already living in the North also enlisted to help. In the Confederate Army, the Confederacy used enslaved African Americans in their armies. So these soldiers did not have a choice in whether or not they were going to fight. Here we have an image of a man on the left and then his slave on the right. So this African American man in this photo is going to fight for the Confederacy in the Civil War, but he doesn't have a choice because he is enslaved in the Confederacy. It's important to note that African American soldiers on both sides experienced discrimination, which means that people didn't treat them equally, and they served in segregated units. And segregated means that they were separate from the white soldiers. We're going to look at a man named Robert Smalls. Here he is as a younger man in his 20s or 30s. And he was a U.S. Navy pilot during the Civil War. Before the Civil War, he was born into slavery, and he was actually forced to work for the Confederate Navy during the war. He worked on a boat, on a ship, and one night the white officers and white soldiers left the ship to sleep on shore. While the white soldiers and white officers were off of the ship, he helped his family and the other enslaved crew escape to freedom in Charleston Harbor. They took the ship, it was a very dangerous task, but they took that ship around many different Confederate checkpoints until they reached a Union fort that took them in, and they were free at that point because they were at a United States fort. He, after that, worked for the United States Navy during the war because he did have a lot of knowledge of the harbors and the bays around South and North Carolina, and he had a lot of knowledge about how to pilot a ship. This is the same man, Robert Smalls, but many years later. After the Civil War, he becomes a U.S. congressman. He is elected to the United States House of Representatives in Congress after the war. Remember, Congress is the place that we make our laws in the U.S. So he goes from being born into slavery to escaping to freedom, fighting in the Civil War, and then being elected to the place where they can make laws for the country. It's an amazing story. He also makes enough money to buy the actual plantation that he was enslaved on as a child. So again, he's born into slavery on this plantation, and then years later actually purchases and buys that plantation. So now he owns it for himself and his family. While he's a congressman, he works for the U.S. Congress and for the state of South Carolina Congress. He actually creates a bill that makes South Carolina the first state with free public education. Public education, or education that's available for everybody, was a really important cause for him. He was very passionate about it. After the Civil War, millions of enslaved men, women, and children are freed by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. So after the Civil War, slavery is abolished in the entire United States. Slavery is not allowed anywhere in the U.S. after the Civil War because of the 13th Amendment. This has a really huge impact on the millions of people who were enslaved in the South and in the West, because now they have their freedom and they can go earn money and work for themselves and own property and have all of the great things that come with that freedom. Next, we're going to look at the effect on the landscape. And I think it's important to note that where each of these explosions was a battle of the Civil War. So most of the destruction of the battlefields is going to be felt in the middle, near the border states, and in the South, the states that were the Confederacy during the Civil War. So we're going to look at some real images of the aftermath of battles. And these are the kind of images that Matthew Brady would have taken as a photographer. So we can see that we have property that's been destructed. Unfortunately, we have some livestock and some horses that didn't make it on whatever farm this battlefield took place on. That would have affected the person who owned that land and the person who owned those animals. We also see the destruction of buildings. So if there's a battle and it's near a city or a town, the buildings of that city or town would have been destroyed, just like in this photograph. We also have the destruction of railroads, and this was an actual strategy that both sides used because remember, there were no planes, there were no cars. The fastest and easiest way to get troops or soldiers and supplies or medical supplies or ammunition from one point to another would be to put it on a train. So, one of the strategies of the Civil War was to destroy train tracks, like you see in this image, where there are no longer any train tracks right here. That's going to make it impossible for the train to get where it needs to go to bring those supplies or soldiers or whatever is on the train. And so after the Civil War, this strategy takes its toll as well because regular people need to be able to move things or travel or sell their goods on railroads. And now they have to rebuild the millions of miles of railroads that have been destroyed during the Civil War. We also learned about the burning of Richmond. Richmond is not the only city to have destruction during the Civil War. Atlanta, Georgia is another major city that was destroyed. But the burning of Richmond is what takes place at the end of the war in April 1865. And we can see in this image the Confederate soldiers who have burned the city on their way out, escaping to the south of the city by crossing the James River. And here we have the Capitol building and a church that actually is still there today, is part of this painting. We're going to see some now real photographs, real images of the aftermath of the burning of Richmond. And here we have one. You can see that Capitol building and that church that's still there in this photograph. And you can also see all of these buildings that are now just kind of shells of a building. All of the people that were in there are gone. All of the property that was in there is gone. And they are going to have to rebuild the city. And here we have another image. And again, we can see the Capitol building and we can see that church that's still there today. And you can see again that we have buildings that used to house people. Maybe they were homes, they may have been businesses, they may have been offices, they may have been parts of the government that now have been destroyed over the course of the war and over the course of the burning of Richmond. So the Civil War affected everybody in the United States. It affected the soldiers, people who were just living their lives near the battlefields, African Americans who fight in the war and earn their freedom after the war. Women, children, and families are all impacted. And everyone has a different experience and a different perspective on the war. But when it was over, the Confederacy was brought back into the United States. So those 11 Confederate states rejoined the US, and we had to come back together as Americans to put our government and our country back together.